Good afternoon, all. Thank you for coming to this webinar. We're very excited to get started. I'm Catherine Lehman. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. And I am so grateful to you all for coming together for this important conversation about promoting safe and supportive school environments. It's a topic we cannot talk about enough to sustain the school communities that we build every year. And as you all will discuss today, we have a lot of evidence over a lot of time of the harm that discrimination in school does to kids. I'll just say that the very first desegregation agreements that Congress directed my office to secure and to enforce included in them addressing school climate, including discriminatory discipline practices. That means that over decades now, the issues that you all are discussing today are issues that have challenged school communities. And that means that when required to go to school to learn lessons in literacy and math, students also have, for decades, received lessons from their schools about their worth as people and their government's readiness for them. The stakes could not be higher. When we teach children that their schools can't support them for who they are, we teach them the wrong lessons. I know from my enforcement work that we can do better, and I believe in you all to be part of that solution. So thank you. I see schools that find ways to keep kids in class safely and appropriately learning in school and support their learners to fulfill their dreams. So as you all will discuss today, there are specific ways not to do that. And we want to support you to manage the ways that do work. The civil rights data we collect from schools are a first window into student experiences. And I'm very glad we make that data available to you all to use, in addition to using the data ourselves here at the Office for Civil Rights. And I want you all to do what we do with the data. Look at it and also look beyond it, to evaluate what is actually happening in classrooms, in schools, and evaluate whether school communities need to change practices. I'm going to just offer some recent examples of that work here in my office. Last month, we closed an investigation of a school district in Iowa with an agreement requiring them to correct their response to repeated racial harassment of a Black middle school student. The student attended school in an already racially isolated environment. His district only had 6% Black students, and the repeated and ugly slurs his peers used to mock him, calling him Blackie and cotton picker and a slave, in addition to the N-word, reduced him to tears in class. But his school administrators were insufficiently responsive to the harms he and his family reported to them. To resolve that investigation, the district agreed with our office, among other things, to reimburse the student's family for therapeutic services, to publish an anti-harassment statement, to train their staff, update all of their policies, conduct a climate survey to understand the scope of race-based harassment in the district, and take other actions. As another example, this past summer, we reached an agreement that requires a school district in California to address racially discriminatory discipline policies. We determined that the district violated federal law by disciplining Black students more frequently and more harshly than similarly situated white students. We made that determination after looking at data, which reflected a pattern of disparate disciplinary actions across type of discipline, school, and grade level that imposed greater harms on Black students than their white peers. And independent of the data, we saw in school records specific instances of unjustifiably harsher discipline for Black students than for white students. I want to bring it home with what I'm talking about for what happened to kids. Again, in middle school, it was a Black 7th grader who was disciplined for his first attendance referral of the school year by receiving a one-day out-of-school suspension. As an important note, the school characterized that child who cut class as having created a hostile educational environment, rather than writing him up for truancy, because the hostile educational environment created a harsher disciplinary penalty. By contrast, an 8th grade white student at the same school who cut class in his 4th attendance referral with 18 prior discipline referrals, as well as 2 bus referrals that year, received after-school detention for one day because the school did not characterize this child as having created a hostile educational environment. Following our review, this district has agreed to federal oversight as they overhaul their discipline practices and policies and identify students who need compensatory education based on discipline practices over the past 5 years, among other remedies. As both of these cases reflect, we in OCR are pleased to enforce the law where needed. But my hope is that following today's webinar, you all will continue your important work to sustain inclusive and healthy school communities with renewed focus and concrete plans for creating equitable and positive school climates that fully satisfy our nation's civil rights guarantees in schools. Don't let your schools become places where OCR needs to enforce. Support your students to the education we believe in and aspire to in this great nation. So thank you for your commitments. I look so much forward to what follows from today's collaboration together. I'm going to turn it over to Loredana now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Lehman. Before we dive into the substance of today's webinar, we have a brief overview of the related funding to which this series is connected to. In June, the President signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, or BSCA, into law. BSCA provides $1 billion to be divided between the School-Based Mental Health Grant Program and the Mental Health Service Professionals Grant Program. These programs expand and provide greater access to mental health services and mental health professionals for all students. BSCA also provided $50 million for the 21st Century Community Learning Centers grant program, which provide academic enrichment opportunities to students during non-school hours, and this has a focus on the engagement of middle and high school students. Finally, BSCA also provided an additional $1 billion for states to competitively award subgrants to high-need school districts. This webinar zeroes in on how states and school districts should consider designing programs under this pot. The Department of Education has designated that these grants are the Stronger Connections Grant Program. Under this program, the department allocated to states their portion of the $1 billion according to the formula under which states receive funding for the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Program. States received their allocations on September 15th of this year. States must now run a competitive subgrant competition to high-need school districts. Most are likely to occur in the late winter or are being designed currently. Each state determines what high need means within their own state context and can determine when to begin running those competitions. Because of the broad range of the activities allowed under the program, school districts have flexibility with how they will promote safer and healthier learning environments for all students. Which brings us to today's part 1 of 2, focus on the importance of selecting high quality and evidence-based strategies under the Stronger Connections Grant Program. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond of the Learning Policy Institute to provide some framing remarks before we begin the discussion.
Thank you so much, Loredana, for that introduction, and Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman for those leading in remarks. I'm pleased to see more investments in student mental health and well-being in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And I hope to see the department highlight this allowable use of funds and guidance to grantees. As states think about what they want to do with the funds that this program is providing, it's important that we have a evidence-based, holistic approach to creating safe and inclusive environments. And the need for approaches that increase students' sense of safety and belonging is essential to address the underlying source of most school shootings, which gave rise to this bill. For example, the shooter in Uvalde, Texas, had been bullied in school, a common characteristic among school shooters. More than 90% of school shootings have been perpetrated by current or former students, and 87% of them left behind evidence that they were victims of severe bullying at school. In addition, many experienced academic or social emotional issues at home and school, were suspended and or expelled, and did not receive mental health or other supports. Clearly, these young people felt alienated and not part of or protected by their school community. They did not have access to the supports that could have helped them. And this fundamental problem, along with the unlimited availability of guns, is really at the root of these horrific events and other school and community threats that we see. And while some commentators have recommended school hardening practices, such as the installation of metal detectors, guns for teachers, and the expansion of police presence in schools as a response to the recent school shootings, the evidence shows that these practices have not been found to increase school safety. First of all, more guns in schools, even in the hands of adults, have been found to contribute to dozens of accidental shootings of children and adults in schools every year. They get left in places, they get pulled out and used in ways that should never have been the case. And also metal detectors and school resource officers have often been found to undermine student outcomes by making students feel more distrusted, alienated, and in some cases pushed out of school. There are places where school resource officers are well trained for restorative practices that glue students to the school community and really help them learn problem-solving skills. But in other places, school resource officers have been given a policing role that has led to more school disciplinary exclusions, increased criminalization of minor offenses that can put young people on a school to prison pipeline. And these zero tolerance approaches ultimately have been found to increase suspensions, which increase dropout rates, that decrease high school graduation and college enrollment rates in very significant ways. Many studies have found that even one single school suspension doubles the chance of dropping out of school. And with each succeeding suspension, those odds increase even further. This information points for the need for the funds to be focused on three practices which are grounded in the research. The first is the importance of positive school environments. The second is school-wide social emotional learning programs to eliminate bullying in schools. And the third is the use of restorative practices to replace exclusionary and disciplinary and discriminatory discipline of the sort that Catherine Lehman described, with strategies that attach young people to a caring community. These moves are supported by what we are learning from the science of learning and development, a body of knowledge recently synthesized by my colleague, Dr. David Osher, who is on the next panel. And we find from this body of neuroscience, developmental science, and learning science research that human development is healthiest when we experience positive developmental relationships, when we're in environments that foster safety and belonging, and offer plentiful supports for learning in an environment that is free of threats. So a positive school environment supports student growth across all the developmental pathways: physical, psychological, cognitive, social, and emotional, while it reduces stress and anxiety that create actual biological impediments to learning that start with the way the brain is functioning and that teach the skills that students need to be successful. Such an environment takes what we call a whole child approach to education, seeking to address the distinctive needs and interests of students as they engage in learning. Researchers have found that the most important components of school climate that contribute to student achievement are associated with relationships between students and teachers, including aspects like warmth, acceptance, teacher support, and protection. Research has found that a stable relationship with at least one caring adult can mediate the effects of even serious adversity. Effective structures to facilitate those relationships can include things like advisory systems in secondary schools, where each advisor stays with 15 or 20 students, meets with them daily, stays with them for 2, 3, or 4 years, is the point of contact with the family, is the point of contact if there are academic needs, and is a place where social and emotional learning and academic support can occur on a regular basis. Other supports like looping teachers with the same students for multiple years and supports for family engagement with schools also matter. When students feel welcome and connected to their school environment, they are much more likely to have improved academic and mental health outcomes. They're less likely to engage in high-risk behaviors. There's a study of adolescent health, a national longitudinal study of adolescent health conducted on a regular basis among, I found this on the web, 7th to 12th grade. Siri is trying to talk to me for some reason. Conducted among 7th to 12th grade students, which found that less than 30% of students felt they were in caring and encouraging environments in our middle and high schools. But that school connectedness was the strongest protective factor to decrease absenteeism, substance abuse, violence, and the risk of unintentional injury. And the CDC suggests 4 factors to improve school connectedness: adult support, belonging to a positive peer group, a commitment to education, and a positive school climate. And when there are those kinds of environments created, which take very proactive efforts on the part of educators, which, by the way, can be supported through the funding in this act for developing social and emotional learning programs and restorative practices, you see gains in both achievement, reductions in mental health problems, and greater school safety. There was a meta-analysis of more than 200 studies that found that students who experienced explicit social and emotional learning, where they were able to learn to recognize and manage their emotions and collaborate and interact successfully with others and problem solve, experienced reductions in misbehavior, aggression, stress, depression, significant increases in achievement. Those schools became safer, experienced less bullying and less misbehavior overall. And these results are found in another set of studies to be sustained over time. And we find that even referrals to the criminal justice system and other dysfunctions in later adult life are ameliorated by social and emotional supports and learning earlier in life. The last thing I'd just like to note is that restorative discipline practices are especially important to keep in mind because Black and Brown students and students with disabilities are subjected to much higher rates of discipline compared to white peers for similar offenses. And those often create this dysfunction and vicious cycle in schools. Restorative practices recognize student behavior as a demonstration of their developmental needs and also give them skills. The use of community circles in which students have the opportunity to share their experiences and feelings with each other, build empathy and community. The use of strategies when there are challenges in school that help students recognize how to make amends and reattach to the community also make a huge difference. We have a study coming out of Learning Policy Institute in the next month that will be demonstrating the strong increases both in safety and student achievement for the greater use of restorative practices and reductions in depression, suicidal ideation, and other mental health traumas as a result of kids getting access to these kinds of practices that glue them to the community on a regular basis. I just want to quote from one person, one student who had that experience and talked about the difference. He said, I dropped out of school. Actually, they kicked me out because I didn't want to give them my hat. It was real zero tolerance. I was expelled for defiance, for putting a hat in my backpack instead of giving it to them. And it has had bad experience since preschool. So it was easy for me to be like, forget this. As a teenager, I was thinking, you just don't care about us anyway. This young person had an option after having been kicked out of school to either go into a sort of juvenile justice setting or go back to a specific school that was using restorative practices. This was in Oakland, California. And he said, after 2 weeks of circles at Alice Walker Academy, I realized it was the first time in my life I ever wanted to be at school. Like, we got circle time, I gotta go. I wanted to be in class, do projects, interact, be one of the first students called on. I felt good being up here. And the school had kids from West Oakland, East Oakland, Richmond, and yet there were only 2 fights in the entire school the whole year. We had kids from South and North Richmond on the same basketball team. The team went undefeated while beating other schools. We were kids that the system said couldn't function in the same environment. That's wild. We did. And he went on to become a restorative practice practitioner who was doing this work with many other schools. I know there's a great discussion coming after me, so I'm going to end here. But I hope that this brief overview that we've provided and the resources that will be shared with you will help you come to decisions about how to design state grant competitions that will encourage school districts to invest in what the research says has a positive impact on a safe, supportive, and inclusive learning environment that in the long run helps all students find a way to their future productively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Darling Hammond. And good afternoon to everyone. My name is Leon Smith, and I am the Executive Director at Citizens for Juvenile Justice, an independent statewide nonprofit organization working to reform and reimagine the juvenile justice and other youth-serving systems in Massachusetts. Prior to coming to CfJJ, I spent many years as an attorney representing young people in the juvenile and criminal justice systems and in education matters like school discipline and special education, working and fighting to prevent young people from entering the school to prison pipeline on an individual case-by-case level before shifting to address the dismantling of that pipeline on a systemic level. I'm very excited to be here with you all this afternoon to moderate this important conversation today with a wonderful group of speakers. And this conversation could not be timelier than it is right now. So many young people over the last few years have endured anxiety and depression and other mental health challenges brought on by the pandemic, inequities with access to learning and resources. A generation of young people right now, their education and their future really hangs in the balance as we try to figure out how to meet their social, emotional, behavioral, and academic needs while maintaining safe, supportive, and healthy schools. And our speakers this afternoon are going to talk from their place of experience about how we can achieve that goal this afternoon. So I'm going to invite each of you to introduce yourselves to our audience, who you are, what brought you to this conversation, and one thing that you really hope the audience leaves with today. I'll start with Dr. David Osher. David, you're still on mute.
So much for etiquette. Thank you very much, Leon. Okay, David Osher, his AIR, American Institutes for Research. I have been studying both what schools can do well and how they do it, and as well as what schools and communities don't do well and how they can either amplify good things, create and amplify good things for young people, or reinforce as well as create problems that lead them into ill-being throughout the rest of their lives. And the one takeaway I would really like people to know is that suspension is a toxic intervention. There may be a few cases where one needs it a little, but just like any medication, there's a warning about what you do. And we'll talk about it more. It's a toxic intervention.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Angela Monell.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Angela Monell, and I'm the proud principal of Southwest Guilford High School in High Point, North Carolina. What brought me to the conversation today are the positive practices that I've implemented at my school. And what I hope, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And what I hope for folks to leave with today are just even some small tweaks that they can take away and that they can do in their schools. And we know change takes time, but just small changes, at a time can really help our students.
Thank you so much. And our third speaker will be Nick. Okay, Nick.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick, pronouns he, him, and they, them. I am a student activist, recently graduated from Baltimore County Public Schools, and I'm currently studying at Cornell University, pursuing a degree in sociology with an undergraduate minor in crime, prison, education, and justice. And what brings me here today is really a desire to share a student perspective, as students are often excluded or tokenized in these conversations where I feel that our voice is needed most. And I hope that you all can walk away today recognizing the contemporary issues afflicting student bodies across the country and walk away with some actionable items that come from a student voice as far as what we can do to solve some of these problems that we're seeing from the perspective and the voice of someone representing a larger group of someones who are directly involved. Thank you.
Thank you all. So let's start our conversation talking about school climate improvement. Both Dr. Darling Hammond and Assistant Secretary Lehman talked about some of the harmful outcomes that we're seeing across the country. Starting with David, can you talk about what research shows is important to creating a positive school climate?
Certainly. And let me start by telling a story that connects both, just as Linda did. In 2005, I was working with Chicago to help them think about high school reform. And they knew my interest in climate, and they said, would you like to go and visit a school that we want to learn from? It was a school in a part of Chicago, North Lawndale, which has many strengths, but is known for having a lot of violence. And it was a school that had gone at that time 188 days without a fight. And what I want to tell you about that school is it was a school where, according to the students, and I met with 15 of them, let me say it differently. The principal said at the beginning of the year, this is not about graduating from high school, it's about graduating from college. The school took money that other places were putting into security guards and metal detectors, and instead had counselors for all 4 years, but also for the first year of college to make sure things happened. And when I spoke to the students and asked them whether or not they were ever being challenged too much in terms of learning academically, what they said is no. And when I probed, I said, how could you say that? It's so different from other places you've been. And they said, and I quote them, the teachers have our backs. And they ended up describing that. And I think that is part of the story here. Now, the teachers there needed the principal to have their backs as well. So it's not a teacher story. It's about creating that environment, Leon. There is a consistent body of research that shows that when young people feel emotionally safe, when they feel psychologically safe, when they feel identity safe, and when they feel physically safe, students are able to learn. What that research also shows is that when students are in environments that are culturally responsive, linguistically competent, where they know that teachers care about them, they are more likely not only to learn, but they are also more likely to learn and practice those social and emotional skills that Linda talked about. What we also know from research is that there is an inextricable link between how you feel in your body and how you feel in your mind and your ability to learn. There isn't a cognitive part of your brain and another part of your brain. They're all interconnected. And when you are under levels of fear and stress, when you feel threatened, when you feel that you can't be yourself, it is harder for you to learn. It is harder for you to remember. And when you feel that the people who are making demands of you are doing that disproportionate in a way that is unequal, and from your perception, unfair, you are less likely to be able to learn the skills you need to end up being a productive member of the school. I'd be happy, there are links here, but I'd be happy to give much more research to people to back these statements up. But this is a consistent body of research that has existed for at least 3 decades, that has gotten stronger. And at the same time, there is a strong body of research that is equally consistent, that shows that hardening does not work, shows that suspension is dangerous, that really demonstrate the fact that students who are suspended, as Linda said even once, and as Assistant Secretary Lehman said, are not only less likely to graduate, they're less likely to go to college. They're more likely to end up within a prison, as we know, and they're more likely to experience ill-being. What the research also shows is that the pipeline to prison that we talk about is not just a pipeline from the door of the school. It's also a pipeline from the classroom. And the classroom can both be a place where students experience connection and support and deep learning and engagement, or it can be a place that is setting them off. And later on with others, I'll share the fact that we know that this can be done and well in terms of creating safe, supportive, engaging learning environments where young people can thrive. And I end here.
Thank you so much, David. Principal Monell, can you build on David's response and talk about how your school realized that there was a need for change, and talk a little bit about the relationship building and understanding how those are really at the foundation of that?
Absolutely. So around 2017, we had a admin team that we really started to dive in. We were looking at our discipline data, and we really started to pull those rules, so to speak, apart. And what did those rules look like? We started doing a lot of equity work at that time also, and the work around that had a lot to do with trusted adults. And so as we started to put those things together, how can we think about those relationships and how important those are as we start to look at our students in classes academically? How are we supporting them? How are we supporting their self-awareness and their self-management and the things that they need? So as we started to look at that, what we know about us is human nature. We're just designed to be connected. And how could we really help students? As we looked at our in-school suspension, even, just walking in there, you see students and they're in there, they might have their heads down or they might have their hoods up. And I just thought it's ineffective, and they're not. What are we doing with that time? If there's a consequence, if that happens, what are we actually doing with that time while they're also doing their academics? So how can we teach them some skills in the process? So as we started to reimagine it, we had kind of read some books on, on restorative practices and what does that look like? And we kind of were at lunch one day and we said, hey, what if we call it Restoration Station? And it was kind of a joke. And then we said, hey, maybe that's it. And as we went from there, we started to reimagine an entire model of, how students, if there's a consequence, if something happens with disrespect or non-compliance, what does that look like? And if they get in trouble for that, what did that look like for them? And how can we teach them, reteach skills? How can we show them how to not get in trouble with that again? Or what did that actual circumstance look like? And how can they have a conversation with that teacher or with that student if there's a conflict? How can they go back to that and not have to be in that challenging situation again? So as we work with the name change, we started to build what we wanted that whole process to look like and wanted our program to look like. And then out of that, we added a schedule. So that schedule started to follow the day, right? Because we didn't have all those things in place. So as we started to build the schedule, we started to build in activities. Each block you're doing, right now they walk in the morning, there's a mood meter. So it started to follow a class schedule. And as we started to unpack what disrespect looks like in one household, it might look different in another household. You know, if one student is talking loud, someone might feel like that's disrespect, but that might not be disrespect for someone else. So as we just started to notice dress code, it was a huge issue. And we had a lot of occurrences of dress code for our students because students didn't have on a collar shirt. So we had to think about a lot of those different policies and how that was impacting our suspension rates. Our leadership team has since revisited that, and we've made adjustments to our dress code policy. So as we started to adjust what our restoration station looked like or what our in-school suspension looked like, and students will even say, this isn't like a regular in-school suspension, because they recognize, you know, when they go in there, they're learning some tools, they're learning how to, it's, you know, they do the check-in, check-out circles, that's part of the day. They'll talk about their occurrence, and some of the students will even hold each other accountable, and they'll say, well, you shouldn't have done that, you know. And so once they're having those conversations, that becomes a little community. They talk, and students, when we started, students were starting to request conferences, because that became a part of, if there was a conflict, you had a conflict with someone, before you went back into class with that person, you had to do a conference and walk through the questions. And once students really talked about how it affected themselves and the other student, or maybe a class, or maybe a teacher, it really helped them reflect. And as we really started to build those things out, it became just about building the relationships in the school, and teachers became a part of the conferences. And you know, we really started from it was a bottom-up approach. I started as assistant principal in 10th grade doing conferences for my students. And my vision was really to be able to teach students lifelong skills that they would need, not just for school, but for community, that they could use at home, and to really get the word out. And we call parents and say, hey, we're going to do this conference. We just want to let you know. And the parents are really excited, you know, and they would say, you mean my kid's going to talk to another student? And it just became a part of what we did. And we're still growing. In the pandemic, we had to shift a little, but we're just jumping back into it to make sure that students have those self-awareness skills, do the check-in, check-outs, have the conferences, and are gearing up to be prepared for what they need.
Thank you so much. So Nick, now I'll turn to you and talk about what really matters to students when it comes to school climate. In your own experience, what measures have you seen really make a positive difference for young people?
Sure. So in my experience, there's a plethora of things I could talk about. As you know, the experience of being a student is so multifaceted and encompasses a variety of different factors of day-to-day school life. But I would say in particular, some things that I've noted are administrative accessibility, by which I mean students often benefit from having a sense that they know what resources are available for them if they're struggling, and they know who is managing those resources or can connect them with them. And so when there is a disconnect between students' needs and the resources that the school provides, or knowledge of the resources that the schools provide, it can lead to a circumstance by which students either don't seek help or only get help in a reactive sense after a problem has already occurred. And one thing I kind of wanted to touch upon in this regard is the fact that in my institution, during the more acute stage of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'll say, a lot of schools in my district instituted mental health services to respond to what was perceived at the time as more severe mental health problems resulting from the pandemic. And this was often involved free in-school therapy or access to a school social worker with which students could communicate about any mental health, familial, or otherwise issues that they were facing. However, as we've now in the collective consciousness seem to have thought that the pandemic is over, a lot of those wraparound services that were implemented on behalf of students have since been removed, even though the underlying needs which they were implemented to address have not gone away. And so I think that it's important when we talk about school safety as a concept that it doesn't begin and end with acts of physical violence. It also encompasses the mental well-being and sense of, security and health of students, even when they're not directly involved with altercations. And in order for us to get serious about preserving that, it is incumbent upon us to look at policies, practices, procedures, and institutions that make sure that students are connected with the administrators and teachers who are making decisions on their behalf, who are issuing discipline, who may not have the entire context of the students' lives, and that students as well have a rapport where they feel even comfortable going to administrators and teachers with such vital information. I think that another thing as well is that there is often derision and tension among students, right? There's this idea of intersectionality, that not all students have the same experiences. And in fact, their experiences are greatly shaped by the intersecting and overlapping nature of the identities that they hold. So as a Black LGBTQ plus student myself, for example, my experience navigating the school building is not going to be the same as that of a white student or a straight student or a cisgender student. And so one thing that I also notice is important within the context of looking at students who come from more marginalized backgrounds is that there is often a lack of connection with, again, teachers and administrators, or even just lack of connection to the school community as a whole, based on the feeling that kids get that they are not represented within the institutions that they are navigating, either through curriculum or because there are no teachers who share their identities, or because there are no staff or faculty members that understand the specific nuances of what people go through in their identity group, and by extension feel that they cannot connect with anybody, which can lead to things like acting out, which can lead to things like violence that we often talk about. So I think that we have to get a bit more expansive about how we conceptualize and define the idea of school safety and extend it to more than just this idea of an abstract, raceless, sexless, universal student archetype, and really hone into the different types of students and what their experiences are, and how we can tailor any resources we make on their behalf to be more culturally specific as a way of meeting their needs. Of course, there's a lot more, but those are two main things that I think are very pivotal and came up a lot at my institution at least.
Thank you so much, Nick. Before we move to the next topic, I want to bounce back to Principal Monell for a moment. I was thinking of your comments. Can you go a little deeper on the policy? So at CfJJ, we're a policy organization and we're always looking for best practices. What policy changes did you end up making? So for example, how did you end up changing the dress code policies to better aid school climate?
So when I first arrived, we were a school that wore collar, shirt, and khakis, and that was our dress code. What we noticed, and we could see in our numbers, there were a high number of our Black and brown students that would end up in, restoration station or ISS, what was called the time, because either they didn't have a collar shirt but it was evident that people, because of how the dress code was, there was a dress code check and people were pretty consistent with that. But what we would find were there were students that their clothes hadn't got washed that week, or, they had gone to the laundromat last week, but they didn't go the following week. So there were real inequities as we started to really look at the data, like why, where these kids live and why and what's going on. And we started to ask the questions. So our leadership team last year, we started to talk about that. Those were real things. And we have students on our leadership team. We have parents on our leadership team, and we're a very diverse school, and our leadership team is pretty diverse. So we really started to give data on, these are things like qualitative data though, what we're hearing from students. So that's a policy change we made. Another policy change that we made was with our discipline policy in terms of, if one of your consequences is 3 days of in-school suspension or something like that, what we might do is instead of the full time, we'll add a conference onto part of that as a way to, number one, that decreases a day or two or whatever it is. And another thing that has the student work with another student to take that lift of the conference and understand and walk through the questions, what happened in this situation? Who did it affect? How did it affect other people? So to have those conversations, and a lot of times what we learned was sometimes that's harder. but I'd rather them learn those skills than have to miss class. So those are some of the policies that we work to adjust. And, you know, when the students, as they work through the conferences, you know, and we've also had students say, I don't want that student to get in trouble. Can we just do a conference? So students get it.
Thank you so much, and thank all of you for the great conversation around school climate. Now we're going to shift to the school to prison pipeline. It's CfJJ in Massachusetts. That is one of our major organizational priorities. When we look at the harm of system involvement and the harm that that has for youth outcomes, dismantling pipelines that drive young people into the juvenile and criminal justice system is so important. So before I pose questions to the panel, I just want to frame for our audience the school to prison pipeline. So coming from the perspective of an attorney and a policy advocate, the way that I like to describe the school to prison pipeline is that it's in reality two simultaneous concurrent pipelines that combine to drive young people out of the classroom and then away from that pathway to success and then towards or into the juvenile or criminal justice system. Those two pipelines are both school discipline and school-based arrest. So we talk about it as one pipeline, but in actuality, school discipline and school-based arrest are both concurrently working to drive our students to these negative outcomes. That school discipline pipeline, we're talking about frequent suspensions and at times expulsions that remove our young people from their classrooms, that disconnects them from the school community. And then once outside of school, research shows that these students are far more at risk of justice system involvement. In fact, young people are twice as likely to be arrested or referred into the system during periods where they're suspended or expelled from school. And this increased likelihood applies both to students with and without a prior history of delinquent behavior. That school-based arrest pipeline, largely driven by SROs and the policy decision to place police officers in schools, involves arrest in schools for behaviors that often can better be resolved through restorative or alternative approaches, or at most school-based sanctions. Students who are arrested and sent into the system, students end up being arrested and pushed into the system rather than having their underlying needs met where they are. Why is this work so important? Because the harm of the school to prison pipeline is clear, as we heard in some of our introductory comments, but I'll simply restate. Young people who have been suspended or expelled from school once, I always say there is no such thing as just a suspension, because one exclusion makes it much more likely that a student will be disciplined similarly again, and twice as likely to drop out. Students who are arrested at school are 3 times as likely to drop out than their peers. And students who drop out of school then become as high as 8 times as likely to end up in the justice system. So we can see how that start at the school level leads to these sorts of negative outcomes. So with that framing, I'll now move the topic over to our speakers, starting right back to you, Principal Manel. Can you talk about how you have used restorative justice to disrupt the school to prison pipeline?
Sure. So I think, you know, you make a valid point. I think what I recognized and what my team recognized was that students would either, the discipline was related to them not knowing the how, or them not having an alternative way to handle something. So that's where we went first. We tried to get to the root of it. So if you don't know how to handle a conflict, then we have to reteach, right? We have to replace that. We have to teach you how to handle the conflict. And that's where we started with the disruption. You know, so if we start there and we teach you, and so if you do get in trouble or you are in what we call RS for something, how can we show you how to better handle a conflict? And that's where we just continue with the conferences. We continue with, providing a different structure. So it doesn't look like you're just in school suspension. It's more about let me spend some time with you and let me teach you how you can handle these things differently. And that's where we spent our time. That's where the investment would come. And as we started to do that, students, like I mentioned, students wanted to, they wanted the conferences and they would ask for the conferences. And Dr. Osher, I think you mentioned about fair process. You talked about that, and that's a big tenet. If students feel like things are fair, because if you just say you're in trouble, someone wrote you up, you're in trouble, you're suspended, and that's it, there's no process. That's not a fair process. Whereas if you work with the student and you try to explain things to them and you let them sit down with someone that they had a conflict with, you have an opportunity, they have an opportunity to have a voice. And that's where that trusted adult relationship, those trusted adult relationships come from. That's where they can even build a relationship with someone that they actually had a conflict. They get to talk about and understand the bigger picture of what happened. And then we can walk away from those conferences with the skills. And every time we walk away from a conference, we say to the student, all right, so these are the skills that we use. Here are the questions. Here are the people you can go to in the event you get into another conflict. And I think, Nick, you made a comment, about getting into and working with students before the conflicts happen. And we have done so much of that this year. I think we've done about 25 conferences so far this year. We've done about 2 classroom resets, and we're still flying and we're still working. We just did our last training, our 3rd training at our school. So it really, the disruption begins when you see that students, when you see where they have the challenges, you get in there and you reteach them the skills so that it doesn't happen again. And that's where we really started to dig in. And, the pandemic, it disrupted everyone, and that was definitely a challenge. We had to reorganize during the pandemic. We created a program called Group Restorative Intervention Practices, where we work with attendants, and, we did some virtual things. But, we're getting back in gear now and getting retraining, getting more people so that we can support students. But we hit the ground running with conferences. And, what we're getting ready to set up is where students can hit a QR code and request a conference. And, the vision that we have here is that, how you have a first responder, if someone, falls or gets hurt, we want to have, restorative responders. So someone's available first block, second block, third block, fourth block, so we can get these conferences going. And, if students get in trouble on the back end, we do conferences. We do them on the front end. We want to make sure that students know what their resources are, understand, they're self-aware. If they have an issue, they can come to someone in the beginning, and we can disrupt that way.
Thank you so much. So, David, I'm going to shift to you. I know here in Massachusetts, we've been involved both on the state level and the municipal level in pushing back on hardening policies and trying to push for more alternatives and interventions. Can you talk a bit about the research on hardening measures and how they're really ineffective, but also give an example of a district that you've seen that has really reimagined school safety in a way that uses evidence-based practices?
Thank you, Leon, and thank you, everybody. Let me just take one study, but it's a big study. A very visionary leader of student support and school safety in New York City asked me what do we know about the dose effects of suspension. Think medication for a second. And no one had studied it. So I said to him, if you can give me access to every student who was eligible to be suspended, and there were about 36 categories of suspension, over a 10-year period, we could use the power of machine learning to really do a study that you would never want to do ethically by having an experiment where, Leon, I'd suspend you, but on the other hand, someone else would not be. But what we were able to do, and there's a brief that describes this, is match students on about 100 different categories, including the specific suspension incident that they had a suspendable offense that they had been accused of. And then we looked at what is the difference both in the current year and over the course of their career in New York City schools of a choice of the school not to suspend. Think of some of the examples Dr. Manel gave, or a small amount of suspension in terms of days, or more suspension, or even more suspension. And guess what? Number one, the more you get, the more harm there is. But in addition, what we found, if we watched in subsequent years, being suspended makes it much more likely that you'll be suspended again, even if your behavior hasn't changed. However, being suspended does contribute to more problematic behavior. Being suspended does contribute to less attendance and therefore is upping chronic absenteeism, which is problematic. Part of the pipeline that Leon's talking about. And being suspended makes it much more less likely that you're going to graduate. But now, in addition, what we did was we said, well, some people say that what you want to do is get rid of David because he's a rotten apple and the whole class will work and the whole school will work. So we used New York City climate work data only for the year young people were suspended because of the fact that we couldn't follow every student in New York City across everything. And what we found is that according to student reports of how they experienced the school climate, in terms of the types of issues that Nick was talking about, they didn't get worse when students were not suspended. And when you look at student academics, where people are saying, again, Nick will learn better if David's out of the classroom, lo and behold, at a school-wide level, that's not the case. Okay, so I could tell you more, but just using that example, which is almost involved about 1,300,000 students over a course of 10 years. That's why I said with confidence that suspension is toxic, but there's a lot of other studies. And there are also studies of other hardening approaches. And there's a link to a blog that I did with my colleague, Sandy Williamson, that I recommend. But in addition, it links at the end to a chapter which is downloaded by 18 leading scholars of violence prevention about what we know works and what we know doesn't work. And again, this is a consistent body. Now let me move to a positive piece. I had the good fortune in 2008 to be asked to lead an audit in Cleveland following a school shooting. And I want you to know that I almost didn't respond positively because I first saw that they'd already put their money into metal detectors. And I thought that any study would be ritualistic. And by chance, the then new chief academic officer, Eric Gordon, who then became ultimately the superintendent, said, please, we really want you to do this because we really want to know what we can do as human beings. They called it humanware, to really create an environment that would be safe. And what I have been able to watch Cleveland do from 2008 to the present is be systematic, be holistic in the way that Dr. Darlingham and Linda was talking about, and create an environment using a multi-tiered approach that focused on school climate and social and emotional learning, and also ended up being more efficient in terms of getting support to students. And that was at the beginning. It has gotten better over time. And when it's really gotten better, it's when the district started to listen more and more to the students. And that happened relatively early, but it grew. And the way it happened early was that the conditions for learning survey that Cleveland chose to use, and there's a link there if people want, it's freely available. And there are other very good surveys that you can also learn about through the National Center for Safe Supportive Learning Environments, and you have links there. But what they did with that survey, which is on the conditions for learning, did students feel emotionally and physically safe? Did they feel supported and connected? Did they feel challenged? Did they feel that their peers and peers have good social and emotional competency? Is they asked students in the schools to unpack it. And then from there, students from the schools became part of a council that met with the superintendent very regularly, where he asked them to unpack things. And that really moved things further. In addition, what Cleveland did from the beginning was it locked arms with the teacher union, and together they worked. And so while Cleveland was not ready in 2008 to do restorative practices, it was doing a lot of other things, but it was not ready for do restorative practices. By 2016-17, the union and the district were working together. And when they developed an approach to restorative practices, they decided to do it not only using evidence-based approaches, but to do it in a way that was providing enough support to students and to teachers to enable it to work. Because one of the other things we know about research is evidence is not enough. It's how you implement. You need Dr. Manel's, you need to be listening to Nick's if that's going to happen. That's the only way you get to quality. Two more things I'll say, there's a lot more, but I've written about Cleveland and there's links to some of the things. Is one of the reasons I was interested in the Cleveland story was when in the 1990s, when I was talking about what one could do, people would say, yeah, but you're showing us examples in Vermont. When you can show it to us in a place like Chicago, then I'll listen to you. Well, Cleveland is one of the most segregated cities in the country. Cleveland was one of the poorest cities in the country. Cleveland was, when the course of change I'm talking about took place during the Great Recession. And yet it sustained an effort. And one of the reasons why it sustained, it was holistic. It used data to improve things. It used the conditions for learning that were listening to students as a major metric. It even built in incentives for teachers if the schools improved in the student reports of conditions for learning. It decided, because the survey was useful enough, instead of doing it once a year, they started doing it more than once a year for improvement. And that wasn't the only thing. And they never ran away from negative data. They looked at it and said, what could we do to do it better? And in a place like Cleveland, as you know, Dr. Manel says, you don't turn things around immediately system-wide, even though you want to try. But as Assistant Secretary Lehman said, every little thing you do can make a difference. And ultimately, each individual has their own intersectional experience. And I think, Nick, you were so right. So it's not only intersectionality, but there is no other person who's just like you, Nick, even if they had those characteristics. And the only way teachers can learn and to end up responding to young people is an environment where they can be attuned to them, but the students can also ultimately say, Dr. Manel, I got to tell you what's giving me a problem. This is what would help, or this is what works for me, rather than being in a situation where they're not being helped. Okay, so let me pass it back to everybody.
Yeah. So, Nick, I'm going to pass to you, but just there was so much there from Dr. Monell and from David. Just a couple of pieces I want to just uplift even more. The importance of implementation and implementing faithful to that best practice or that model. What I've personally seen is, for example, with restorative justice, you'll hear, oh, we tried that restorative justice stuff and it didn't work. When in reality, it was never funded properly. The full array of restorative practices were never implemented. And when you talk to teachers and coordinators, they weren't giving the ongoing training and support needed, or you didn't train enough people in the building to really make it successful. So there's getting buy-in for the practice, but implementation as well. The other thing, just for our audience, amazing resources being posted in the chat. David mentioned the blog that he was a part of. Also, there is a report we did at CfJJ in conjunction with another great Massachusetts organization, Strategies for Youth, called Fail School Policing in Massachusetts. So to the extent that we're talking about the placement of police in schools as a factor that hyperdrives the school to prison pipeline, we did that report to support advocacy on the state and municipal level to support police-free schools. And we honed in on the justifications that were made for policing in schools. So we go through the racialized history of SROs. We go into the research which shows police placement doesn't make schools safer. We go into the research that shows that they don't prevent school shootings, but also how they disproportionately drive young people into the school to prison pipeline, specifically and disproportionately young people of color and young people with disabilities. So I want to just highlight that and the other research resources, which are really rich for you all. Nick, just jump right in, talk about some of the approaches that get pushed as, well, these are going to make students safe, but in actuality, they really don't.
Sure. So one thing I would like to say is that I think that, again, with students not being centered in a lot of these conversations and the adultism that often pervades school policy discussions, I think that, you know, there is a disconnect between what students think they need to feel safe and what policymakers and other decision makers think that students think that they need. And so I think that one of the things that is a big red flag for a lot of students is when they feel like teachers, staff members, and faculty fundamentally don't care about or don't support them. And so I think that there's this tendency for school, like staff members to sort of get this idea that like students need to learn, they need to be educated, and then that's the only social function that needs to be performed between a student and an adult in the school building. But this is patently false and absurd because the school building is where students spend a vast majority of their days. It's where they learn how to exist in society and learn how to socialize. And so the idea that all these emotionally indifferent, apathetic teachers can really meet the support needs of students often leads to circumstances where students are struggling and don't want to reach out for help, or lash out in less productive ways, and then have they just been able to get support from somebody. And again, this does involve a racial, gendered, and other identity-based component, because in a lot of institutions, especially predominantly white institutions, such as the one from which I graduated, there is often a disconnect along racial lines, as Black and other minority students may often get the impression that the white staff members at their school building don't have their best interests at heart or have no interest in connecting with them beyond a grade level, beyond how one is performing on tests, and how somebody is actually existing outside the classroom, what their home life is like, what maybe the extenuating circumstances affecting their performance in the class. I think that another thing that's concerning is when there's a lack of institutional support. A lot of times there is this impression, or I might as well call it a misconception, and I don't know where it stems from, but it nonetheless is pervasive, that young people don't deal with mental health issues, or that this is something that we are detached from until we reach the magical age of adulthood. And this is completely false, as I find that with a lot of my personal experiences and those of my peers, there is an abundance of mental health and home life issues that contribute to negative outcomes that the students of our nation are experiencing. And so, you know, in a society where we're seeing things like students going back to underserved communities, unstable and maybe even abusive homes, I think that there needs to be an availability of professionals who can assist them. But in a lot of institutions, that's practically non-existent. Like I mentioned, in my institution, how it wasn't existent until the pandemic and has now faded to exist again. And what ends up happening as a result of this dynamic is that students who need services the most, which disproportionately tend to be Black, Brown, Indigenous, women, and queer students, are shut off and ignored. And so I think that these are just a couple of things that students are really keeping in mind that I don't think adults are. And because they aren't, the disconnect is leading to more problems than would exist otherwise.
Wonderful answer, Nick. And so it's sort of the last word before we pivot to Q&A. David, you put a really great comment in the chat about student voice that I'd love to hear you just express about student surveys and how that could be impactful. Oh, and you're on mute.
Okay. What are the reasons why surveys are important if they are good surveys? And if they are answered in a confidential way, is people can feel safer in providing information. They have to be the right questions. They have to be designed in a way that they can really work. And while you ought to also survey adults, and there are examples of places that do good surveys of adults as well, that no matter what, I think it is important to survey young people, in part because of that disconnection that Nick is talking about. And while ideally what you want is the ability to be as intersectional as possible in making sense of that data while protecting confidentiality, probably you need to combine good surveys with then really making sure that all the people who need to be heard ultimately can interpret that data. Because of the fact that if I really developed a survey and disaggregated it, not just in terms of whether or not someone was Black or white or Latinx, male or female, but I really started to get more specific in many schools, then there might be a risk that people say, people are going to identify me and know the results. And so there's that dilemma, but you want both. And when it is done in a way that students know it will be taken seriously and that they feel safe in giving it, they give honest responses. There are high response levels. And what's important is that those surveys cannot just be ritualistic. They have to be taken seriously. So again, if we use the example of Cleveland, schools and the district regularly look at that data and say, what can we do? How can we do things to make things better? And the young people who are being surveyed have to know that. And I think what's important for people who are listening to know is that there are a variety of surveys that are freely available that are good. There are also a lot of surveys out there that may be less good. And I do refer people to the National Center on Safe, Supportive Learning Environments because it was charged with vetting surveys. And you can see there's a whole list of surveys, but when you're looking at surveys, make sure that there is a survey that is getting at young people and that it's not just a survey about climate. You know, it may be warm outside, but the real issue is, what is it like in your room? And therefore you want to get those issues, as Linda Darwin Hammond said, that are closer to people. You know, does Nick, if I can use you, Nick, feel emotionally safe? Does he feel that he can be the person that he described? That's what you want to get at. Does he feel that the teachers do have his back? That's really important, et cetera, and not just whether or not people feel safe. You want more than that. You want the elements of safety. I'd be happy to talk more, but I want to make sure other people can talk. But I do think it's important to know that when done well, students will respond. They will respond more honestly if they know you will use it. And then if you really use it, they will even help you in making the school better, because again, you need to be listening to every Nick in the classroom because every Nick is different. And it's only when they trust you that you're going to help meet their needs.
Absolutely.
And also, and let me just add, in that supportive environment, we know for over 30 years, that it's in those situations where students are more likely than, if David is coming in to school with a gun, Nick, who knows David, is going to go to Mr. Smith and say, Mr. Smith, I'm concerned about David, rather than in a situation where one feels that one cannot trust Mr. Smith.
Bingo. This is such a deep, rich topic, and there's so much great research out there. There's so many people working on this issue. We could absolutely go on for another hour or hours on this, but unfortunately our time is getting short. So before, I'm going to pass to each of you all for about 2 minutes for a closing thought, but there was one question that came through. Most of your questions were answered in the chat, but one asked about the school to prison to deportation pipeline. And I would be remiss if I did not share a harrowing story from Boston that really drove some of our important work back in 2020. If you have police officers in schools, and at CfJJ, we stand on the premise that police should be removed from schools and we should have police-free schools. It is so important to have policies that limit information sharing. We saw in Boston public schools what happens when your school police are regularly communicating with their gang unit in the police department, and that sharing of information results in young people's information ending up in gang databases. So in Boston, a young man who had never been suspended, never been arrested, and was a pretty much model student, intervened in an argument between two other students. Upon witnessing that, nothing else happened. They went their separate ways. He ended up in a gang database. Fast forward, he ends up going before immigration court, and he ends up being deported back to El Salvador because he is on a gang database, which the criteria are so flimsy and random. The bar is so low. You can talk to the wrong person or wear the wrong color, you can end up on it. And when officers are in schools just observing students every day, that's information that if it ends up in a database like that and a kid goes to court, it can have worse outcomes, but for our undocumented students, it can absolutely increase the chances of deportation. So we were able, on the district level in Boston policy, but also as a part of state police reform, greatly limit the sharing of information between schools and police, understanding that it negatively affected all students, but it had a particular harmful effect on our immigrant and our undocumented community. So I wanted to just direct that to that question, because that's something that it's an additional part of the school to prison pipeline we have to pay special attention to. So I will quickly ping. I will start with Dr. Monell, and then Nick, and then David. Closing words and closing thoughts.
Sure, thank you. So, I just want to say that student voice is critically important. And, as we, work through our conferences, that has been so eye-opening for students to be able to reflect. It teaches them the skills to reflect. It teaches them the skills for empathy, to understand what other people were thinking. It helps them understand, and Nick talked about this, it helps them to understand other people's situations. When students do conferences with teachers, for an adult to sit with you and say, I didn't realize I made you feel that way, that's heartwarming for a student, to hear an adult accept responsibility in a situation. So it's extremely powerful that we do listen to our students. And what we've gathered, the data we gathered after our conferences, talking to students, they feel that they've had a safe space and a brave space to say how they felt about a situation, and they walk away with the tools. And if we can do anything, we can get to the root of why some of the students are feeling what they're feeling. If we give them the skills so they can walk away knowing maybe how to handle a situation next time, that can help decrease our rates. And if we also can give them a trusted adult in the building and let them know who to go to, that can just help build our positive practices in schools and continue to do the work. And nothing's going to happen overnight. I think we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware that we are, amidst this pandemic, it's been tough for our students. And whatever we can do to implement positive practices in the school, small changes at a time, we can support our students.
Thank you. Nick, your parting words for our group.
Yeah, thank you. Fundamentally, I think that the conversations that are often being had around school discipline, school safety, school policy in general are unfortunately not a resemblance of the conversation that was had here today. We had a very granular, multifaceted, and nuanced analysis of the aspects of all those things that extend beyond the physical school building into the lives of students, the communities of students, and the futures of students long term. But I think that there is a very reductive view of education that many people adopt, which sees our debt to students as beginning and ending when the school bell rings for the first time and ends for the last time, respectively. And I think that this is not only a self-evidently dangerous way of thinking, but the data speaks for itself and the outcomes are readily visible. I think that it's important for us to continue the spirit with which this conversation was had and recognize that students are people and their lives simply intersect with the school building. It is not had in its entirety within its four walls. And that means that we need to get much more expansive and specific in how we seek to target many of the issues that we're seeking in a way that recognizes that we need to address the external factors such as the home life, the criminal justice system, and the other intersecting and overlapping aspects of student life and public life, that of which school is simply one factor. I want to close off with an idea that a writer who I love said one time. They said that we don't have achievement gaps, we have a lack of educational reparations. And I think that I'm hopeful that with student voices like mine being amplified and further analysis into the ways that we can support students and center them and amplify what it is that they want and they need, we can start getting in that process of investing in and delivering in those educational reparations to the student populations who we have so historically and contemporarily underserved. Thank y'all for having me today.
No, thank you. And Nick, I'm going to need you to drop that quote in the chat so I get it right, because I'm absolutely going to be using that one. David, what's your final word?
My final word is we know enough already to stop doing things that are harmful. We also know enough to start doing things that really can work. And in order to do that, we really have to address what we do know from what Linda Darling-Hammond talked about at the beginning, the science of learning development, which is that ultimately people live and grow individually and collectively 24/7 across their entire life course. And that ultimately that affects what goes on in school, but it also means the effects of what goes on in schools, both individually and collectively for groups. And that if we want to really create the conditions that we've been talking about today that are possible, I've seen it. I've met many Nicks. I've met many Dr. Manels. I've met many lawyers like Leon Smith who are ready to do this. It's really important to make sure that we build people's capacity to do that, which includes the conditions to work, the conditions to collaborate. And that includes both understanding that young people are unique and have all these needs, but also that the teachers and adults are humans who also need to be supported and safe in an environment so that they can collaborate together. And my final piece here is that on the one hand, we've known this for a long time. We know it much more now. We know it much more scientifically. And the timing, the situation of young people now and what they will be facing over the course of the next 30 years is such that we must turn things around. And that means creating these safe, supportive environments where young people can be deeply engaged in learning and thrive. That's the other pipeline. That's the pathway we want, not those two pipelines that Leon talked about.
Thank you all. I mean, you guys pretty much said it all. I will just end to say that we have to invest in and promote approaches that play the long game and that focus on getting our students and our young people ultimately where they need to be. There's this clinging to and over-reliance on these immediate, only looking in the short term, knee-jerk responses to youth behavior. But what we learned about recidivism in the criminal and juvenile justice context also comes into that school to prison pipeline, that when we invest in young people, when we invest in their development, as Dr. Monell stated, and when we teach and when we build and we give supports and we meet their underlying needs, we're giving these young people tools that will be there to build them up through graduation and beyond. We know how the responses that are far too frequently used now lead to young people having these negative outcomes. And we have to break that cycle of just considering that our young people can't be collateral damage. You know, we have to say there is a different way. And for our local elected officials, our school board members who continue to perpetuate these ideas, we have to break them out of that zero sum, either it's hardening or it's nothing but chaos. That's a blatant lie. That you have heard about the alternatives, you have heard there's a different way, and we all have a role in advocating for that change. So I want to thank my fellow speakers and just thank everyone for the opportunity to be here and to participate. We hope that this was enriching for you and to our audience. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful holiday.